On the morning of the 18th of April 2019, Andrew Freund frantically called 911 to report his 5-year-old son AJ missing. The investigation that followed not only revealed the extensive abuse that AJ had faced at the hands of the two people he should have been able to trust the most in the world, but also highlighted systemic failures in the way Illinois social workers look after the most vulnerable people in their state. Failures that may have led to the deaths of many more children than poor AJ. This is the tragic case of AJ Freund. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me as ever. If you are new to my channel, you just stumbled across and you're interested in this case, just for your information, I release my crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday every week. Crime and consistency is my catchphrase. Also, you'll note if you watch me regularly that I do cover a lot of child deaths, whether that's murder or whether it's to do with neglect. The reason I do that is because of the work that I did with children. It's an obsession for me to think about how we can better protect children. And whenever I hear about these kind of deaths and killings, it just pricks my conscience to a point where I need to research and find out more. So for those of you who know my channel, you'll appreciate this because you'll know my history. But for those of you who may have come across quite a few child deaths, that's why I orientate myself towards these in particular. I was a safeguarding expert for a long period of time in my work. It's something that I hold very dearly, both professionally and personally, because I'm a mother. And the idea of anyone so much of laying a hand on their hair or heads is enough to make me feel so incensed that I would not know what to do. I don't know what the consequences would be. I imagine they wouldn't be very good for the person doing anything negative to my child. And that's how we expect as well-adjusted parents to act. We feel a level of rage if anyone does anything that could cause any kind of problem to our child's lives. And when you hear about parents who abandon the very role that they're meant to engage in when they give birth to children or become parents to children, it is blindsiding, because it's hard for people who care for children to connect that there could ever be a reason to be anything but loving, caring and compassionate to the children that we are gifted with. So let's take a look at this unbelievably brutal and tragic case. It's as simple as that. It really is a brutal and tragic case. So a phone call happens on the 18th of April 2019. It's 8 a.m. in the morning. Andrew Freund calls 911. And he's doing this because his 5-year-old son, just bear that in mind, we're talking about a 5-year-old at this moment, Andrew Thomas Freund Jr., known as AJ, has just gone missing. He's 5. For those of you who haven't had kids yet, you may not be able to monitor in your own head what it would be like to have a 5-year-old because you haven't had one. Therefore, even imagining what a 5-year-old would be like is quite difficult. But you will have been 5, and you will probably have noted that at 5 years of age, you aren't leaving home by yourself of your own volition, because often you don't even know where the key to get out the door is. Also, just throwing it out there, in the night, you're asleep, because at the end of the day, you're a child, and the way your child's body works is that you need your rest. But let's just throw it out there. Let's just go down an imaginative route regarding how a child may wake up in the middle of the night. What would be normal for that child? Well, I would throw out running and finding your parents because you're scared you woke up in the dark, and actually being awake in the early hours can be quite scary. Monsters under the bed and all of those things that you manifest in your head and imagination. But even if you were to wake up in the night and not feel the pang of fear, so you go and find your primary caregivers, on the whole, you're just going to lie there until you go back to sleep. Maybe you'll get up and have a cheeky play with your toys. But that's where it's going to end on the whole. And if your parents are ringing in the morning to let the police know that you have gone missing, what we will expect is sheer hysteria. And I mean sheer hysteria. If a 5-year-old child is not in the home when you wake up, the likelihood is the 5-year-old child has been abducted, because 5-year-old kids don't go off wandering in the night. It's scary. It goes against the grain of being a child. So this parent tells the dispatcher, we've checked the closets, the basement, the garage, everywhere. Said he'd scoured the park, the nearby school, and a local gas station down here where we sometimes take him to buy treats, quote. Sorry? You have, after discovering, let me repeat it, that your 5-year-old child, a child who has been on this earth for a mere 60 months, you believe that you, after discovering that he's no longer present in the house, should just go off and have a wander around the local area, particularly the gas station. As a 5-year-old, if I wasn't up, out, in the middle of the night, popping down to my local gas station to check on the petrol prices and maybe buy myself some sweets, I don't know what I was doing on an evening. It does not make any sense whatsoever. You wake up in the morning, your kid isn't present at that age, you get on the phone because you are terrified and horrified about the possibility that something terrible has happened to your baby. You do not drive off and check the local school. Again, when in the history of children going missing does the child be found in education? I've just gone to have some extra lessons in the middle of the night or in the early hours. Said no child ever. It doesn't make any sense, but this is the story that is being told this early on at the very beginning of AJ going missing.
911, what's the address of your emergency? Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
We have a missing child. Woke up this morning and he wasn't.
How old is the child?
Yeah, missing child.
Yeah, how old is he?
He's 5.
And what was he last seen wearing?
A Mario, like blue long sleeve sweatshirt and a black sweatpants.
And is he a male white?
Yes.
Okay. And when was the last time you seen him?
Last night, probably 9:30, when he went to bed.
Okay. Are you the father?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know where you met him when?
No. We've canvassed the neighborhood. Yeah, I went to the local park, the local gas station down here where we sometimes take him to buy treats. I spoke with the assistant principal over there at the school where the park is, and they haven't seen Kim or any other child. I have no idea where he would be.
So you put him to bed last night, so he was in his pajamas, and then when you tried to get him for school, he wasn't there, and then you left around for a bit?
Yes.
Have you checked everywhere, like under tables or in closets?
Closets, the basement, the garage, everywhere.
Okay. What's your child's name?
Andrew, last name Freund. We call him AJ.
Friend is P-R-E-N-D?
F-R-E-U-N-D.
Was any of the doors open?
No. I mean, no outside doors or anything like that.
No doors or windows?
No.
Officer's phone on door now.
Okay, yeah, I see him.
And it's really interesting that he throws in the fact that, he takes them to the local gas station sometimes to buy treats, because that's a parent trying to immediately suggest that they're good parents. Listen, we take them out, buy them sweets, etc. We're good parents, caring parents, loving parents, but that is not where your head would be. The last thing that you are considering when on the phone to the emergency services when your child is missing is to defend your parenting skills. All you care about is getting your baby back. You would be absolutely horrified. And like I said, my expectation of a parent in that scenario who's authentically dealing with a missing child, it's hysteria. It's absolute hysteria, because horror and terror and panic takes over. You don't give a list of where you've searched. So of course, the authorities take this really seriously. We've got a little boy who has disappeared. They arrive at 94 Dole Avenue, which is in Crystal Lake, where AJ lived. And they obviously meet up at this point with Andrew Freund, his father, and Joanne Cunningham, who's the mother. Also, there's a younger brother there, Parker Freund. He'd been born on the 30th of December 2014. So they get to the home, and the police are really concerned immediately. It is a state. It is disgusting. There is no other word to describe it than being an absolute hole of a place. To say it's disarrayed would be the biggest understatement ever. To say it was cluttered would equally be an understatement, because what it is an absolute disgrace. It's got mess everywhere. And we're talking every type of mess that one could imagine. Food waste, human waste, dog waste, all over. In the basement, police had to literally move garbage bags just so they could clear a path to walk through it. And when they moved those bags, apparently cockroaches scattered everywhere. So this is something that's been a problem in the household for a period of time, hence why all of the insects are there. They're having a ripe old time with this festering rubbish. Outside of AJ's room, police actually noticed, and they were concerned about this, that there was a sliding chain lock. And that sliding chain lock would mean that you could actually secure the room from the outside. So if you're the child in there, you can't actually leave of your own volition. And that is deeply concerning. I appreciate that some people will have children who have problems in the night, like sleepwalking. It's rare. And to some degree, they may feel it's important for the child's safety to put a lock on the door, but it's incredibly rare to do that. And even in those circumstances, I would argue it's inappropriate. Firstly, it's a danger hazard. You should never lock a child in a bedroom, because if a fire breaks out, there's a problem there. But also, it's the messaging that it gives to a child. It makes them scared, it makes them fearful, and there are better routes to deal with those problems than to basically make that child a prisoner. When they go in the room, police immediately can see that there are mouse droppings on the floor. So that, again, demonstrates that they are not cleaning the home at all. These mice are coming in, making a mess, and they're attracted to things like waste food or waste products on the floor, or empty packets, etc. So we are again being introduced to the fact that this is a problem that's been going on for a long time, because the mice have had an opportunity to take hold in that situation. The police also noticed that the windows in his room were secured shut with screws. So they are basically locking this child in. And I don't know about you, I'm just throwing it out there, but if you have a lock on the door and you have screws on the windows, how the hell does a 5-year-old get out to go down the gas station potentially to buy himself some sweets? It's just not in line with what we're seeing in the environment. The police at this point make a report to the Illinois Department of Child and Family Services, DCFS, because they can see straight away there is another child in that environment, and they've got inadequate supervision clearly because of the state of the place, and he's not in a safe environment. So at this point, Parker Freund is removed from the home by social workers, and the police then continue to search the surrounding area. But their actions immediately introduce you to the knowledge that they're suspecting the parents have had something potentially to do with AJ's going missing. Because why would they be so intent immediately on getting Parker out of the way? And from my perspective, on a professional level, these individuals see environments that are, shall we say, inadequate a great deal. Police are used to that. And even when they go to environments like that, they'll often be very forgiving of them if they sense that the adults present are people who genuinely care for the kids. I'm not saying that they won't then make a referral. Of course they will. They'll make a referral to the appropriate services to try to get them some help. But removing the child isn't top of the list, because they can see that there is a problem situation, but it isn't down to the children not being loved or cared for. And so in this situation, it's like an immediate response, get Parker out of the place. And that's because I think immediately they're looking at this couple and thinking, we don't know what's happened to AJ, but we sure as hell don't want the same thing to happen to Parker. The police immediately start questioning the parents. Of course they do. They're the last people to know where AJ was and the last people to have any understanding of what might have happened. Joanne, AJ's mother, she just denies having absolutely any knowledge whatsoever of AJ's whereabouts. I know nothing. Absolutely nothing. But this is your house, and surely as this is your house and child, you would know something. But I'm saying I know nothing. But I feel like you should at least be able to advise us of some potential things that could have happened. Nothing. If you think about something and you consider what something is, which should be what I have, at least something, I'm the opposite. I'm nothing. Something, nothing. I'm here, right over here. I know nothing. I slept heavily, don't know anything. Anyway, that's where they're starting with her. That she's basically put him to bed the night before, woke up, and he was just missing. In spite of the lock on his door and windows, he was just absolutely missing. The community, when they hear that this little boy has just vanished, they're all really concerned. They're concerned for a lot of reasons. For a start, many of the residents of this very close-knit community had no idea that there were children living at that address. And that is concerning because we expect to see paraphernalia, shall we say, that relates to children being present on the property. And if they are not present, it often suggests that that child is not having the best time because we expect to have playthings around the home and outside of the home that indicate a child is enjoying themselves in that world. And the community literally had no idea that kids were there. So they also now are dealing with a potential abduction that's going to concern them for their own children. And if they have suspicions that something awful might have happened at the hands of his parents, they also have a weight of responsibility because they didn't know on the whole there were kids there, but also what could they have done to prevent some kind of tragedy playing out. Now the TV stations get involved immediately. There is a 5-year-old child that has not been found. And Joanne appears on television outside her home with her attorney. This is where I genuinely believe that some kind of hand should come down from the heavens and just play a game of bop. You know, where it just like squashes whatever it is that it needs to squash. In this moment, it would be Joanne live on television. But I kid you not, she appears on television outside her home along with her recently hired attorney, George Killis. And this is to appeal for help in finding her son.
Everyone, my name is George Killis. I'm an attorney. This is Joanne Cunningham, the mother of AJ. Joanne came here today to stay, hoping that AJ would come back at any moment and walk through the house. But I think the house has gone through a search and the house is in a pretty rough shape and everything inside it. And quite frankly, it's very depressing to Miss Cunningham and she doesn't want to stay here. So for the next 48 hours at least, she's going to be staying with a friend. Miss Cunningham doesn't know what happened to AJ and had nothing to do with the disappearance of AJ. Miss Cunningham is worried sick, she's devastated. And we are asking for a little bit of privacy and understanding and compassion from you guys and the rest of the community, please. And we are asking for the community's help in trying to find AJ. If anyone has information as to what may have happened to him, we ask that they please come forward and talk to the police. And that is all I have to say for now. Okay, well, thank you guys very much. It's Killis. Killis.
JoAnn, want to say, just want to pull a word, or you would like to say anything?
No, not right now. She's in very, very bad shape emotionally, and I want to avoid any statements. I want to give her space, and I want to give her privacy. I will say that Miss Cunningham had nothing to do with the disappearance of AJ. She's innocent of any wrongdoing, and I would ask you guys to not assume the worst. I would ask the community to not assume the worst. I would ask the community to come together and help us locate AJ.
Unheard, you said you're representing Miss Cunningham here. What about Mr. Friend?
I do not know about Mr. Freund. I am not his attorney.
Is Miss Cunningham cooperating with the police?
Miss Cunningham cooperated with the police extensively yesterday until at some point we got the impression that she may be considered a suspect. I don't know whether she is or not, and I don't know how serious that consideration is. But as an attorney, once I realized that, I advised Miss Cunningham to remain silent from that point on. But she cooperated extensively up until then.
Any parent who found themselves with their child missing would scream from the rooftops in every state, in every place, in every circumstance, as loudly as possible, as hysterically as possible, as calmly as possible if you could muster being calm in that moment, but you would do it. You would speak it, you would say it, you would share it, because all you care about, all you're considering in that moment is, how do I get my child home? Maybe somebody has them, maybe I can plead with that person. Maybe my child is missing and has been taken in elsewhere and they'll hear me speaking this, they'll know I care. The last thing you are going to do when you find that your child has vanished, when you are considering all the potential outcomes and possibilities of what may have happened to your darling little boy or girl, is to think, what I need to do is to hire an attorney. But that's what she does. She hires George Killerless because apparently she fears that she is a suspect, thus making her seem most definitely like a suspect. To not immediately be speaking to every news outlet possible to bring him home, but instead to be thinking about speaking to an attorney prior to doing that, that gives you insight into a very warped, very egocentric mind. Because if you are innocent, you don't care whether the police think you're guilty. You have nothing to prove. You have no concerns about being caught for a crime you did not commit. It is not registering. But in this case, for this woman, for this apparent mother, the priority she has is for herself and her own freedom, and the advice that she needs to retain it. Now, Killerless says on screen that Joanne is worried sick and has nothing to do with AJ's appearance. Sorry? She has nothing to do with AJ's appearance. She's worried sick. Why has she hired you, an attorney? Because she's worried sick. Is she worried about AJ? She's worried. She's worried sick. She's worried sick. But is she worried about AJ? Because you saying she's worried sick sounds quite passionate, but at the same time, I'm wondering, is it that she's worried sick about AJ or worried sick about herself? Well, she is worried sick about herself. AJ, she's worried sick about herself and how she feels about AJ. I mean, at this point, do we even need to go any further than to just lock her up and throw away the key? But yes, this is how worried sick mothers apparently act when their child has disappeared. Let's look at Andrew Freund for a minute, the father in this case as well. Let's go through the backgrounds of each parent. So Andrew Freund was born in 1959. He grew up in Crystal Lake, Illinois. Childhood friends kind of described him as a nice guy. They said he was a popular and quiet person, apparently had a wry sense of humour, had a lot of potential. So in school he was actually voted class of 77's most desirable date. It's interesting, isn't it, how those future-focused ideas are often wrong. So his parents divorced when he was 16. His father had alcohol problems. The two had a really distant relationship. So clearly there was dysfunction. It's difficult when you're growing up with a parent who's alcoholic. He remained living with his mother. His mother was a registered nurse. She worked part-time. And the two of them had a really close relationship, a good relationship. So as much as he had a dysfunctional and distant relationship with dad, she certainly made up for it. He graduated with really high honours from the University of Illinois, got a bachelor's degree in accounting, and then he earned a law degree from John Marshall Law School in Chicago 3 years later. So he's very bright, very capable, and you would imagine going into the law field, there was a level of pro-social behaviour about his character. He did, unfortunately, start to develop a problem with alcohol. That was following his parents' divorce, and clearly his father was also an alcoholic. And when you think about the disease factor, you are so much more likely to have problems with alcohol if one of your primary caregivers was an alcoholic, both physiologically, as in connecting with that addiction, but also experientially, because you've got used to that kind of behaviour and there's a permission base for it. And when he went to college, it worsened. And that makes sense, because when you go and hang out with loads of young people and your peers, you're often encouraged to drink and have fun and party, and it's embedded in that scene, so it doesn't feel like a big deal. And if you have a problem, it helps to disguise that issue. So it seems to exacerbate his problems further. He does settle at a Crystal Lake law firm, but he did get asked to leave in 1994, and that was down to his alcohol problems. This point, he realises he's got to do something about it. He sought out a substance abuse treatment, but just kept relapsing with alcohol, and he starts relapsing with opioids as well. So whenever he is struggling and stressed in his personal life or professional life, he'll return to those substances to cope. And his mother died in 2006, and this was a real trigger for him. He started to relapse again heavily. And again, we understand when people haven't managed to figure out coping strategies that alleviate their need to return, and they face stresses such as grief, it is something that often makes people return to these negative behaviours. Now, over the next 15 years, he actually practiced law. So he managed to do that. It was on and off, and it was always out of his home. But he did manage to retain work to some degree, but he didn't do very well financially because it was so on and off. So in 2012, he got part-time work at a local grocery store. And even though that would seem like a fall from grace for somebody who's so capable and academic, I completely understand that. If you're in a situation where anything that stresses you returns you to a position where you might actually return to the abusive scenario with the dependency issues that you've got, then you're going to want to do something that's easier. You're going to want to do something that means you don't necessarily have to be stressed going home. So anything that's going to reduce the stress and mean that you don't return to your substance misuse is going to be something that's effective at helping you cope in your life. Now let's take a moment to look at JoAnn Cunningham's background. So JoAnn's parents, they married in the summer of 1979. So that was just 2 years after Andrew Freund had graduated high school. So notably, there is an age gap between Andrew and JoAnn. So her mother, Laurel Hughes, she was 18 when she actually got married. So that's young. It really is. It's a young age to get married. It's a young age to start your journey together, but equally, lots of people do it successfully. JoAnn Doris Cunningham is born on February the 28th, 1983, but the very same year that she is born, her mum actually asks for a divorce. And she also sought an order of protection. So she claims that her husband had an uncontrollable temper and also had a very mean and violent disposition. He also drank heavily. So again, this is an inhospitable environment for a child to live within. And her mother, I would say, is absolutely right for making the choice to actually get divorced, because you don't want to be around somebody who is violent, and you certainly don't want to introduce children growing up into that environment, which is challenging and chaotic. The divorce gets finalised September 1984. This is when JoAnn was 19 months of age, and her dad's life fell apart, really. So he served 3 stints in prison. That was during the late 80s and 90s. He was using drugs from the age of 14. So he had a life of dependency, and he was only 44 when he died. That was in 2003. When he died, he was described by the authorities as being a long-time homeless man with a history of alcohol and drug abuse who suffered a fatal head injury after an accidental fall on the pavement. So a really, really tragic life, and one I imagine that will have had a big impact on JoAnn. Also, we're looking at the historical dependency issue where families have literally generations of people who have problems with dependency. The parent passes it on to the child, and it does feel like that's what happens where JoAnn is concerned. So he was never really involved in her life, but certainly that shadow influence is there. Even if your father hasn't been present, if you know he's a dependent, if you know he's had alcohol issues and so on and so forth, it does stay in your conscience. And it's one of those things that I think children carry throughout their early childhoods and teenagehoods, because there's always that question, why did they choose the dependency over me? And it does give you issues with self-worth, and it does make you feel a level of abandonment, and they can be really difficult feelings and emotions to hold. She was somebody, aside from that, who apparently had a very happy childhood. She was a good student. She wanted to be an artist, and she did show quite a lot of promise. She was even good enough to be accepted into an invitation-only art camp where she was able to study under the guidance of local artists. So she showed real promise. But life happens and things go wrong, and they did. So JoAnn gets pregnant at the age of 16, and this led to her dropping out of school. She moves in with a boyfriend at this point, a guy called Christopher Butler. So 16, you are on the whole not prepared psychologically, emotionally, or physically to become a mother. I know people do it, and they do it really well, and they make great successes of their lives. But on the whole, it is not ideal to have a child at 16 and move out of home to live with your partner, because there are so many things that you have to learn and grow into, and it can be overwhelming and very challenging. And having the independence at that age doesn't mean that you are prepared to actually manage it. So her son is born in 2000. JoAnn, with respect, according to reports, was apparently a really amazing mother. She spent all her time with him. Apparently by the age of 5, he was good enough to be the banker in Monopoly, which beats me because I never understand how those games work, full stop. The relationship with his father, it lasted nearly a decade. So they were successful to a degree in holding that family together in spite of it being a very young one. But sadly, it's punctuated by violence. And she obviously puts up with that during that decade period. That could be because she's prioritizing her child and feeling that she wants the family to be together. It means potentially that she's just somebody who's willing to accept those kind of breaches in boundaries. But it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, in spite of the fact that apparently she doted on that child. In March 2003, Butler is actually charged with domestic battery after he punches JoAnn in the stomach. So that's horrible that he's being that violent towards his partner. That's a real high level of domestic violence. But she posts his bail the next day, and then she drops all the charges. So she's willing to put up with this kind of behaviour, and that speaks to me of such low self-esteem, that she sees herself as somebody who is potentially deserving of those actions, and that she is willing to allow him back into her life and her home and into her child's life in spite of how abusive he is. But as noted, their relationship does end, which is fortunate because we don't want a child being brought up around that kind of level of abuse. And it's at this point JoAnn's mum and stepfather, they step in and they help to raise her boy. This is while she actually completes cosmetology school, and she became licensed at that profession in 2005. So she's obviously bright as well. We get to 2006. She begins dating a guy called Craig Summercamp. He served in the US Marine Corps in the Iraq War. The family said, look, he was a really nice guy. Allegedly complete opposite of her previous boyfriend, which you'd hope because her ex-boyfriend was a violent scumbag. But the family obviously approve of this and are hopeful. If you get somebody who's been in the US Marine Corps and is an upstanding citizen, you're going to hope that they're going to be a great influence in JoAnn's life. We get to New Year's Eve 2007, and they actually get engaged, and he gave her a $10,000 engagement ring. And that demonstrates a real commitment to her. He's obviously excited about their future. And this is her moment, isn't it? This is her opportunity to stride forward into a future that she deserves, that she can embrace. But like so many situations that seem perfect on the surface, there is a problem bubbling beneath. Because at this time, JoAnn Cunningham begins taking prescription painkillers. She developed really chronic back pain after she'd been working really long hours on her feet because she was a hairstylist and cosmetology teacher. So as a way of managing this, she starts taking these prescription painkillers. And we all know how absolutely barbaric some of these painkillers are as far as what they do to the person taking them. You just have to watch shows like Dopesick, which are obviously dramatized, but they're dramatized versions of reality of the OxyContin crisis in America, where people were just prescribed this unbelievably strong addictive opioid for really minor pains, let alone strong pains. And whilst very effective at a painkiller, they're also highly effective at changing your neural pathways in your brain, connecting you with addiction and making you feel helpless to the cycle that you are dealing with of being a dependent. So this begins the cycle of dependency for JoAnn Cunningham. And it's really sad when you see that medical experts have started the downfall of so many people's lives. It doesn't excuse what we're talking about today, by the way, in any way, shape or form at all. You all know me. It comes down to a young person or a child being killed in any way, in any neglectful context or murder, etc. And I have no problem in calling out the heinous human beings who do it. But we always want to look at the chain of causation. We always want to see, could this have been prevented? Is it possible that there could have been a different outcome? And I think where dependency is concerned, that has been started by the medical organisations that we trust, then absolutely we can say that if that had not occurred, there could have been a different outcome, and that would have been a less tragic outcome than I cover today. She marries Craig in 2009, in the May of that year. And in 2011, interestingly, she became a licensed foster parent to her 6-year-old godson. So a distant relative of her ex-boyfriend, Christopher Butler, had had a child, and she takes that child in. Less than 3 years later, though, in January 2012, her new husband files for divorce. And the reason he files for divorce is he says that JoAnn Cunningham has become really violent during arguments. Allegedly, twice she punched him in the face. She threw hot coffee at him. She tried to kick him down a flight of stairs, and they're all high-level abuse scenarios. Kicking somebody downstairs could literally kill them, but also throwing hot coffee on somebody. Everybody knows what it's like to scald themselves. We've all done it at some point in our life. You know how painful it is. And surface area burning, when you think about the amount of damage a hot cup of coffee could do, it could cause enormous problems for that person. So she's quite willing to do some very severe damage to somebody if they annoy her. And clearly he does the right thing in escaping a very abusive situation, a very dangerous situation. So at this point, JoAnn Cunningham's actually on a mix of 12 to 15 painkillers a day. This is including Percocet, morphine, and other drugs. So she's really hooked now. She admitted that she did buy them illegally on the street because she gets to a point where the doctors say, we can't give you any more. Well, again, it's not enough to just say to a patient, we can't give you any more. We think you're abusing them. It's like, what next? How can you help that person manage coming off those prescription drugs safely? Because what will happen is they now have this connection, they now have this pain relief that might soothe their emotional, psychological and physical needs, and it's removed. That's going to increase stress. Stress is going to make you more angry, more frustrated. And if you have violent tendencies, it's going to make you more dangerous. So it's really important to think about how you can help people get off prescription drugs. But obviously, she doesn't feel that that's occurred. It hasn't been helpful, whatever's taken place to get her to a point where she's come off the drugs. So she's just buying them and she's getting them easily. Craig Summercamp actually said, our marriage started off well and it was like a switch flipped in her head. She got hooked on pills and it all went downhill super fast. And it must have been blindsiding for Craig Summercamp because he goes from being with this woman who is apparently quite a doting mother. She's committed to her career, she's working, and then in a matter of short time, she's hooked on painkillers, violent, and the future that he believed was going to be there, the foundations have fallen away, and it's a disaster. But it just demonstrates how dependency can literally change your life so quickly. And again, We have to consider the fact that her father was a dependent, so she has a much trickier time, without a doubt, negotiating any kind of chemicals or any kinds of alcohol issues in her life because of that thread of connection, with the potential for her developing these kind of dependency issues because there is a predisposition physiologically within her. Next, we get to Joanne and Andrew, which are obviously the parents that are involved in this case. So Joanne, at the point that she meets Andrew, she's in a really hopeless place. She can't afford a solicitor to represent her throughout her divorce from summer camp. And she's in the courthouse, in a corridor there, crying because she's struggling in this situation. And that's where Andrew finds her. So he's so moved by this woman being so upset about her financial problems and how that's impacting on her family and her divorce, that he says, you know what, I'm legally trained. I will help you for free. That would have been like winning the lottery in that moment. And you can imagine that she would be instantly drawn to the kindness. And finding a solicitor who's willing to work for you on a pro bono level is just like finding gold. And she must have felt saved in that moment. So he's now going to represent her. And hopefully that's going to mean that she can get the issues resolved in her divorce. Now, during that situation, they obviously decide that they're going to be more than client and attorney, shall we say, and they get romantically involved. During the following year, police, however, are regularly called to her house because she's becoming more and more paranoid. So on one hand, she's trying to get everything resolved regarding her divorce. She's got a knight in shining armour, shall we say, and he and her have started to become romantically involved, but there's this continuing decline. It's not having a positive impact on her life. She's spiralling more in her behaviour. And the very fact that she's now got this paranoia, if you think about dependency-induced psychosis, these are certainly things that we could explore as a potential that's going on for Joanne Cunningham. She calls the police to her home quite a lot. She asks them to investigate whether someone's bugged her home, hacked into her phone or email. She even accuses summer camp in the divorce case of calling DCFS with false allegations about her as a mother. Now, the DCFS had actually received 2 hotline calls that month, and they alleged that Joanne was abusing prescription drugs and also neglecting a foster child. And her mother said that she did have substance abuse issues at that moment in time, but that the paranoia seemed to be exacerbated through that. Also, we've got to be honest, whoever called DCFS was telling the truth. So even if summer camp had done that and she felt paranoid about that, the paranoia stems from the reality of the fact that she is abusing prescription drugs and that she is in the care of a child that she should be doing a better job around. But real problematic behaviours, and people who know her, care for her and are around her are deeply concerned. We get to August 2012, and at this point Joanne moves into Andrew Freund's house. This is on Dole Avenue, and this is where their actual sexual relationship begins. So they become friendly, but they hadn't actually started being intimate until she moves in. Joanne is then accused of causing nearly $20,000 worth of damage to her ex's house. So before she leaves that home, apparently she trashes it. So the house reeked of dog waste, it reeked of urine, it had insect and mold infestations, and it had major damage to things like kitchen appliances, fires, etc. So this isn't simply a case of her just letting something go into rack and ruin. This is more about her being callous, and she's purposefully and willfully damaged kitchen appliances, screwed up lots of the interiors because she wants to give him a message. She wants to let him know how angry she is with him. And we've all been through breakups. We've all been through breakups. And yes, many of us have thought how nice it might be, I don't know, to put a kipper down the back of a radiator, hoping that in those winter months there'll be a fishy smell around. A lot of people have had ideas about what they would do if they were the kind of person that allowed themselves to do it. But the thing is, 99% of us would never do anything like damage somebody else's home, because even if they've upset us, we see that there is a boundary there psychologically that should indeed be present. She does not have that boundary. Joanne Cunningham does not play by the same rules that you or I would. And even though she has problems with dependency, that does not give her a reasoning or an excuse to act so malevolently. It says something about a darker interior emotionally, one that maybe other people don't see very often, but you get on the wrong side of her and in the right circumstances, you will pay the price. Now, when Cunningham moves into Freund's house, her presence apparently changed everything. So he had a roommate at the time. They'd worked at the grocery store together, and he first documented trouble between Joanne and Andrew within literally days of her moving in. And by the end of 2012 alone, there would be over half a dozen police calls. So very chaotic, very problematic, very aggressive, and it's a big change. This is not what the roommate has been used to seeing. This is more of a Joanne Cunningham issue than an Andrew issue. Although, of course, if he lets her stay and accepts that kind of behaviour, then to some degree, he's contributing to that situation. That said friend stated that Joanne definitely had the most volatile temper. Out of the two of them, she was the one who exacerbated a more aggressive tone and was more likely to contribute to an escalation in arguments. And he compared her personality type to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So very much somebody who could switch quickly. And then, in spite of what I've just said, which should lead us to go, and that's why Andrew and Joanne's relationship ended, because within the first few months, there were just police coming to the houses all the time because they were a nightmare couple. But why should that stop you from having a child? I mean, you know, when you're really stressed and when life is tough and when you've got dependency issues and when you and your new partner can't keep a lid on it because you're constantly arguing with one another, what you really need to do is to have a baby. Because we all know the thing about babies is they're so calming. And if you're in a really stressful situation, when you put a baby into that situation, they just soothe it completely. They're known for it. Babies should be given out to really stressed human beings because there is literally nothing about a baby's behaviour whatsoever that could ever potentially increase a level of stress in the home. So of course these two decide that that's probably the best thing to do, to have AJ. So in spite of this new, troublesome, problematic and volatile relationship, they decide to bring this poor little boy into the world. So October the 14th, 2013, this amazing little boy is born. So now we've had a little bit of background on his parents. Let's get back to April the 18th. So Andrew Freund gets interviewed and he is asked to describe his son. He describes him as stubborn and headstrong. Again, this is not language that is typical when describing a missing child. The last thing that you are going to do is cloud the investigator who is looking for your baby, their perspective and perception of your child. You don't want them to be thinking that they're stubborn and headstrong. They might just have walked off by themselves. You want them to be deeply concerned and literally turning over every stone to find them and bring them home. So using this kind of language is negative. And again, that's not where a loving parent would be or feel when we are dealing with the situation that's unfolding right now. And he also said this about AJ. He said, AJ believed that he was the leader. If we suggest that he needs to stop watching a movie and put away the toys, if that's not what he wants to do, he may not do it. In his mind, he's the leader and he doesn't have to listen. Sorry, God, can we just rewind? You're saying, let me just check this out. Can we just check this out? Because I'm an investigator and I'm listening to you, but I think I might have got some points wrong there because you were just saying it was really headstrong and stubborn. So let's just go through what you're actually saying here. You're saying that when you ask him to tidy up, put his toys away, or to stop watching a movie, sometimes he says no and won't do it. That's how headstrong he is. How headstrong is that? How stubborn is that? How headstrong and stubborn is that? Well, I think that what you're describing is every average child in the whole world. Every average child that's ever been. Just a child. That's not stubborn. It's not headstrong, is it? It's absolutely normal. A kid's watching a movie. They want to watch the movie. That's what they want to do. You ask them to put away the toys, they might think about 100 things to do before putting away the toys. Doesn't make them problematic. But we're being introduced, aren't we, to the idea that maybe anything that AJ did was a problem. No matter how typical and normal it was for his age, it's been pinpointed as problematic behaviour. And so any action is amplified to make him seem like he's naughty as opposed to normal. He also went on to state that AJ was subject to spankings and time-outs as a form of discipline, but he went on to note that they always gave him a few chances. But again, if I was being interviewed by the police, this is not something I'm going to be engaging in. I don't want to talk about my parenting of this child. I want to talk about how my child's going to be brought home. And again, there is a defensiveness by suggesting that AJ is the problem. I'm noting that I'm not, as the parent, the issue. And I'm actually going to then reinforce that by saying he's always given a few chances. Yes, there is a level of aggression in the household, i.e. spankings, but it's only because we're good parents. He also went on to note that Joanne Cunningham was the primary caregiver to AJ and Parker, and he described that as a father, he wasn't very present. So he had this really grueling work schedule, and he was out of the house at 6 a.m. in the morning, didn't get back till 9:30 p.m. at night. If that is the case, clearly you would not have a lot of time with your children. They're going to be asleep, and you aren't going to have a lot of power over what happens in the day, but you'd have eyes. And if you do see your child at any point and they're injured or skinny or unwell, you're going to be able to acknowledge it. But at this point, Andrew is clearly trying to put his hands up and go, I don't know anything. I'm not even present in the house. I don't even hardly live here, and so on and so forth. Now, bear in mind, the house is filthy, and the behaviour of both parents is really unusual. The FBI at this point and Crystal Lake Police, because of this, are given a search warrant, and that search warrant actually gave them access to Andrew Freund's phone, which is very, very telling, because it's revealed that at approximately 3 a.m. on April the 15th, 2019, a Google search was made for child CPR. Now, I have 3 children. I have never once in my entire life Googled child CPR. Call me a parent who's a little bit on the superstitious side. I don't like doing things like looking those terms up because I don't want to tempt fate. It's ridiculous. I know. Go with me on this. I also salute single magpies. Why? Because once upon a time, my best mate when I was a kid, Trisha Lowe, said, if you salute one single magpie, it gets rid of the sorrow. So I've always done it. It makes no sense, and I'm not sure it makes a difference, but nonetheless, I do it. And I'm one of those people who wouldn't tempt fate by searching for child CPR. So it's unusual behaviour. I believe that very few of us would do that. However, if you do that around the time your child goes missing, it's going to be a massive red flag to everybody, because the chances that at 3 a.m. in the morning you're Googling anything like that is so statistically an anomaly, and that provokes the immediate concern of the investigators. The subsequent interview after this, on April the 24th, 2019, when he's basically confronted with this evidence, Andrew Freund realises, I'm going to have to tell the truth, the game's up. So he reveals exactly what happened to AJ. We all need to remember that Andrew Freund is legally trained, so he knows that it's far better when the game's up to actually say, okay, I'm guilty, etc., because it's going to be something that's brought up in court, and it also means that you're more likely to be given things like a plea deal. So admitting that you are guilty of something is far better than waiting for it to be discovered. And as soon as he knows that they have access to that phone and they've found that information, it looks really bad for him, because child CPR and a search for that could indicate that he's the person who's done harm to AJ. But because of this, he starts to tell them everything. So he indicated that AJ had died at some point on the evening of April the 14th. This was after Joanne had engaged in some hitting and AJ had been placed in a cold shower. Joanne then woke Andrew up at 3 a.m, told him that AJ wasn't breathing, at which point they rang the emergency services to say that there is a child in distress, or a child who's gravely ill, or a child who's deceased. No, of course he didn't do that. No, why would you do that? Why would you do the logical linear thing that anyone who's innocent in their lives would do, which is to immediately call the experts? Now, why do that? When instead you can use Google. Just look up child CPR, have a go yourself. The last thing that anyone who's got nothing to hide would do is go ahead and try to figure things out themselves. You're on the phone to the ambulance services saying, please come, my child is not breathing. But after they've taken the time to Google and they've taken the time to realise that AJ is actually dead, again, what's next? Right, this is terrible. This is a horrific thing. Clearly you haven't meant to kill our child, or clearly our child has died and we need to know why. Therefore, we ring the police and ambulance services and they come and deal with it. That's the next step. No. Why do that? Why would you do what is legally required of you to do? Particularly where Andrew is concerned, he's a trained lawyer. And yet his response to this is he will handle it. So he tells Joanne Cunningham, his apparent girlfriend, that he will handle this. And his handling of this situation, now his beautiful little boy is dead. I mean, this is unbelievable because this is so demonstrative of how disconnected Andrew is from this child. Because I want you to just place yourself in a position where, as a parent, you are woken up by your partner. Your absolute gift, your beautiful child, is dead. You feel potentially that they're responsible for it. What is the next stage? Now, some people would feel a level of rage where that person who they felt was responsible for killing their child would also be at risk. Some people would immediately become hysterical, run out of the house, try and get a neighbour, ask for some help, get them to call emergency services. Some would just get on the phone straight away and call emergency services themselves. Because if you have a level of connection with a child who's either gravely ill or deceased, you will be broken into a million pieces immediately. To tell your partner when they have given you that information, it's all right, I'll handle it. And by handling it, you're meaning that you'll take that little boy's body, you'll place it in a large plastic bag in the basement and just leave it there until April the 17th, where you drive it to a rural area just outside of Woodstock, Illinois, and there bury that beautiful little boy's body in a shallow grave. What kind of person, what kind of parent, what kind of father could ever do that? But that's what Andrew does. It's so far outside the realms of our expectation where parenting is concerned. Because like I said, there are so many other things that you would do if your partner told you that they'd found your shared child dead. And burying them in a shallow grave, it ain't even on the list. That's what murderers do. It's not what loving parents do. So the level of disconnect that Andrew has with his son is telling in that moment. And also, why protect this Joanne Cunningham? This failure, this fiend of a mother, this violent human being who has tortured this little boy knowingly and willingly. To me, that says that Andrew Freund is absolutely complicit. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew that this little boy was gravely ill. He knew that he'd been treated horrifically. He knew there was a consequence and potential that he might die because of the treatment at her hands. And he just stood there and let it be. Because at the end of the day, he works long hours, so it's not really his fault. AJ's death will have been horrific. So when he's questioned on how AJ ended up in the cold shower, Andrew said, quote, "It wasn't intentional. In the past, Joanne would hit him, and oftentimes I had to intercede and stop this from happening. And I tried to convince Joanne that that's not the way to go, okay? And now he's 5. So she'd come up with the idea of putting him in like a cold shower as punishment. So we're introduced to a lot of things in that statement, aren't we? First of all, Andrew knows it's wrong. He's been challenging her on the way that she's been treating AJ. She's obviously been hitting AJ to a point where he has felt uncomfortable and said, we've got to find better ways to do it. But as opposed to JoAnn thinking, I don't know, maybe I should take some parenting classes. Instead, she's resorted to torturing him by putting him in a cold shower. And anybody who's ever been in a cold shower, it takes your breath away and it can be very uncomfortable. And this child is 5 years of age. So he's accepted her doing that. He then tells them that she put him in that shower for 20 minutes. And this will break your heart. The reason that she put him in that shower for 20 minutes was because he was being punished for hiding underwear that he had soiled. A child of 5 who we would fully understand is having accidents in their underwear because they are traumatized. That's what children do when they are traumatized. They can't control their bladders and bowels very often. And at 5 years of age, lots of children have accidents anyway that aren't dealing with these horrible environments. But the distinction between those children and the child that we're talking about today is that he gets abused for daring to be a normal child. So he has hidden them. He's actually gone to the trouble of thinking, oh my God, there's going to be a horrible consequence if I don't hide these somewhere. And of course, she's enjoyed finding them because now she has an excuse to torture him further. Now, during that 20 minutes that he's been just horribly trapped in that shower, his mother and father walk in and out of the bathrooms. This is when it's running. And he said that he would have let AJ out any time, that he was ready to tell the truth, but he wouldn't tell the truth. Why do you think it's acceptable to torture your little boy for soiling his pants, who's now scared of telling you that he hid them because he was afraid of the consequences? Why would you not put 2 and 2 together and think, why is this child, my child, so scared of us? But no, he's just engaged in the same torture that JoAnn has decided is appropriate. And JoAnn Cunningham makes it worse for AJ because she would spray him in the face with the shower head. And sometimes, because he was in a weakened state anyway, he'd actually lose balance, he'd fall into the tub. And this constant interrogation about the underwear was just going on and on and on. Now, eventually, Andrew takes AJ out of the shower and puts him to bed. He put him to bed when he was naked and wet, so he didn't even get him dried off. And he said that aside from spanking him, I didn't do any other physical abuse to him. Well, you know what? That's a load of bullshit. Because if I stand and watch somebody being tortured and do nothing to try to help that person, and I allow the person who's torturing them to continue, and I'm nice to the person who's torturing that individual, and I don't challenge them, I just collude with them to allow it to carry on, I am 100% a part of that abuse. So him saying, I didn't actually physically abuse him, I just let somebody else do it for me, that doesn't cut the mustard with me. As far as I'm concerned, Andrew is guilty as hell. He's equally guilty because he could have prevented it. He could have stopped it. And more than that, as a father, he should have wanted to. Now Andrew's confessed on the 24th of 2019. He takes the police to AJ's body. And at this point, they get him. They take him for an autopsy. The autopsy is performed by Dr. Mark Wittek, who's a forensic pathologist. And the injuries were awful. You know, the idea that AJ died that night and only that night because of, shall we say, an accident, because they went a little bit over the top with their punishment, is just absolute BS. It's clear the abuse has been extensive and it's been long term. So that doctor revealed multiple blunt force injuries to this little gorgeous child's head, torso, the extremities. He found severe swelling of the head soft tissues with multiple bruises and abrasions. He found severe swelling of the brain, multiple abrasions and contusions of the torso and all 4 limbs, bilateral inhaled blood in his lungs. He had patterned injuries of small circular abrasions on the centre of his forehead, and that matched the pattern of the detachable shower head in Freund's bathroom. All of this meant that AJ's injuries were absolutely consistent with child abuse. They weren't consistent with hypothermia or falling. So it hadn't just been an accident that evening. It hadn't simply been a mistake because they'd let him get wet and then he'd frozen to death. It was clear there had been systematic attack on that little boy for a period of time. The police removed all the evidence from the Dole Avenue home. This included a shovel, included a toddler mattress. It had several lawn bags, a large tub from the basement. Animal control took full possession of the family dog, a boxer named Lucy. I imagine Lucy was thrilled to be removed from that environment, believe me. And there were just crowds in Crystal Lake and Woodstock where they came from as a family, because they'd been waiting for news about what had happened to that little boy. And of course, the news breaks out that AJ isn't missing, but he's dead. And the community is crestfallen. They are absolutely heartbroken. People are interviewed on the street and they feel responsible for not knowing that there was a child in distress in their area. People are absolutely blindsided that this has happened on their watch, essentially, without them being aware of such a distraught situation playing out. Both Andrew Freund and Joanne Cunningham get arrested. They're both charged with first-degree murder. Bond was set at $5 million each, so I don't know, no one was coming to get them bailed, were they? No one cares. Everybody wants them to rot in hell. It's as simple as that. On April 29th, both Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund agreed that DCFS can take care of their youngest son, Parker, and prosecutors at this point want to revoke the former couple's parental rights. It's really strange with Andrew Freund and Joanne Cunningham because essentially they're kind of seen still as a couple to some degree. They're living with each other. But at this point, before her arrest, she's actually been in a relationship with another guy for a period of time. So she's actually pregnant with a guy called Dan Nowalki, and she has obviously been in a relationship with him to a degree where she's become his fiance. Just throwing it out there. A little bit weird dynamics, living at home with the guy that you might still see a bit, but is essentially her ex, whilst dating a guy who's been in prison for basically attacking his ex-partner. So obviously she's going down a road that's going to be super successful anyway. So there's a really strange dynamic going on in the home per se. It's good that Parker gets removed. Then on May the 10th, both Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund plead not guilty to all the charges. Bear in mind, Andrew, that is, has admitted to basically burying the child in a shallow grave, and he's identified the fact that she was the person present when the child was killed, but now neither of them were actually guilty at all. On May the 31st, Joanne gives birth to a girl whilst in custody. At that point, the child is taken into custody by DCFS, of course. You're hardly going to be leaving that little girl with their mother, are you? And then they start to build the case. So prosecutors start seeking access to both AJ and Cunningham's previous medical records. They're given access to both of them. On September the 26th, 2019, Joanne gives this really uncomfortable jailhouse interview. It's with CBS. And obviously she's challenged during that interview. She's asked questions like, why were you taking drugs when you were pregnant? Because that's going to mean that your child's born addicted to drugs. She kind of excuses her own behaviour. She talks about heroin just being evil and that it's the devil and therefore that she's this victim. But when she's asked about her little boy, her 5-year-old little boy, just think about it. We're talking about an infant essentially. And she describes him as having ODD, which is oppositional defiance disorder. If you think about somebody being really vindictive, that kind of nature, somebody who goes out of their way to go against authority, that is not how a 5-year-old acts. But that's what she's saying. She's projecting blame onto this gorgeous little boy. Also, the interviewer says to her, why were you being so nasty to him? And brings up the fact that he'd wet himself and he'd had an accident and he was getting this horrible abuse based on that. And she then kind of argues the toss and says, well, at the end of the day, you know, what parent wouldn't punish their child for having an accident? Well, no good parent. Just throwing it out. No good parent, Joanne. None. None of the good parents in the world would punish a child for having an accident in their underwear. It is one of those things that's quite normal. But instead, she's the innocent victim. She's done nothing wrong. She's just the dependent. And at the end of the day, we should feel sorry for her. She would never do anything to hurt her child. But yes, she would punish them horribly for wetting their pants or having an accident in their pants, and that she feels completely entitled to have done that. So it's a really conflicting, really contradictory interview. It's deeply uncomfortable to watch, and the interviewer just gives her a grilling and clearly has no empathy or sympathy with her. But it is, like I said, very telling that this woman sees herself as being the victim and sees the son who has done nothing wrong as the individual deserving of her wrath because he failed to tell her that he'd wet himself. We get to December the 5th, 2019, and at this point, understandably, because she will have been advised by her lawyers, she changes her plea to guilty. So she pleads guilty to the first-degree murder of AJ Freund, and that's because she didn't have a cat in hell's chance of ever getting off with it. Can we all be honest about this? She did it because she probably didn't want people ripping her apart in court on cross-examination, which they would have done. I bet the only people who were disappointed that she pled that she was guilty was the prosecution, who would have liked to have taught her a new arsehole, shall we say. When it gets to the sentencing hearing, the prosecutors provided Judge Wilburn with just a plethora of damning evidence. So there was lots of the same evidence that they would have presented if she had said she was not guilty. The lead prosecutor, Patrick Kennelly, he basically wants the maximum penalty. He wants to give her 60 years behind bars because of the absolute brutality of the crime. They had loads of witness testimonies. They had lots of people come in and say that they had been deeply concerned about what was going on behind closed doors. So Janelle Bennett, she lived at 105 Dole Avenue, so the same row of houses. And on the 31st of October 2017, she was really confused because Joanne Cunningham arrived with AJ at her house. It was trick or treat, but it was really late. It was way past all the other children coming around. And when she looked at what he was wearing outfit-wise, she actually thought he'd been dressed as a mummy because he had bandages on, he had a lot of Vaseline on his face, but he looked like he got clumps of hair missing. So she questioned Joanne Cunningham on this. And Joanne Cunningham said, oh no, it isn't basically an outfit for Halloween. He basically got really badly burnt. Boiling water was accidentally spilled over him. He was 3 at the time, 3 years of age. What was he doing near boiling water? You've either made a mistake in supervising him as a parent, or you have purposefully, and I believe in this case she did purposefully, pour boiling water over him. Then the same neighbour, in 2017 or 2018, she couldn't absolutely recall, she's walking her dog in front of the defendant's house, so in front of Joanne Cunningham's house, and she actually sees Parker, his younger brother. He's only wearing a nappy. He's left in a running car on their driveway, and he was yelling, "Daddy, I'm cold." And she could literally hear Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund arguing inside the house. Janelle actually stayed to observe until Joanne came storming out of the house, and then she confronted her. She said, "You'd better not fucking call the cops on us." So she's threatening her. Janelle was about to respond, and Joanne just turned to her and said, "Leave me the fuck alone." So she seems like a whole heap of lovely, doesn't she? Then we have James Rosso. He lived at 105 Dole Avenue. On Halloween, he'd also observed AJ to have this number of bandages on various parts of his body. And again, he'd had the same story. Boiling water had been spilt on him. Somebody called Adam Lamberti. He'd been employed at the BCU Credit Union in Crystal Lake. He'd been there for several years. Freund and Cunningham had both had a deposit account there and also 2 auto loans at BCU. So he'd seen them regularly. And on 3 occasions in the spring of 2018, Adam actually noticed that AJ had significant bruising. First of all, he noticed that he'd got a really dark black eye and he'd got bruises on the back of his neck and arms. And when he questioned Joanne on that, Joanne said that he'd accidentally fallen downstairs. A lot of accidents, aren't they? I mean, accidentally spilling boiling water on himself, accidentally falling down the stairs. And then the second occasion, which was just 3 weeks later, that same guy noticed that AJ had got a cut and also a black and blue bruise on his arm and on his face. Joanne, when questioned on this, said that AJ had snuck into the basement and hit himself with power tools. I kid you not. In a world of excuses where abuse is concerned, that's the first one I've ever heard regarding a child sneaking down into the basement and just, I don't know, picking up a drill and thinking, I'll just smack myself around the head with it. It's what kids do all the time, isn't it? If you're not in the garage protecting your child for themselves as they pick up power tools to bruise themselves with, I don't know what you're doing. But this is, again, just rolling off her tongue immediately. It doesn't matter how outlandish the claims sound. She's quite content to just say whatever she needs to say to evidence why her child has been injured. And on the third occasion, Adam sees that AJ's got bruising to his face. At this point, I don't know, Joanne's gone through all her excuses, so she doesn't actually offer him any explanation at that point. But Adam is obviously very concerned about how consistent these injuries are. Then we've got David Lewis. So David Lewis, March 18th, 2018, he's working as a social worker at Gottileb Memorial Hospital, which is in Melrose Park. Joanne Cunningham had actually been transported to the ER because she'd been found asleep in her car. They found fresh track marks up and down her arms, so it's clear that she'd been taking drugs and was under the influence. Andrew, Freund and AJ subsequently arrived at the hospital. And that social worker immediately notices that AJ's got bruises on his face and on his forehead and actually goes ahead and reports that. Jessica Crabtree, another person, she'd been friends with Joanne for 5 years. And in 2019, she'd noticed that AJ had injuries on his face on 2 separate occasions. First occasion, Joanne Cunningham said he was burned by a pot of water. Second, that he'd fallen down the stairs while sleepwalking. So I imagine that coincides with what Adam had seen himself. Then we've got a police officer, Kimberly Shipbow. 18th December 2018, Joanne Cunningham had called the police to report that her Suboxone medications had been stolen by Daniel Nowicki. That's the guy she was having the affair with, who impregnated her, and basically she was carrying his child when she was arrested. But obviously she's very annoyed that this guy that she's in love with has stolen her medication and wants that brought back. Police officer turns up, notices the house is absolutely disgusting, notices the ceiling is literally falling down, the floor's torn up, the children's bedroom smelled of poo, and there was loads of dog urine on the floor. So that must have been nice for the officer to walk into. Also, she noticed that there was a large bruise on AJ's hip, and even said that she questioned AJ about the softball-sized bruise on his body, and Cunningham, in her presence, basically coached him, said what to say to her, and leaned down to AJ's ear and said, "Lucy, the dog did that to you, right?" So that immediately concerns that officer. And following this, AJ gets taken to Northwestern Hospital in Woodstock and gets examined by Dr. JoAnn. And Dr. Channon reported that he did indeed have contusions to his right hip and also to AJ's upper lip. Talks to AJ about that. And initially, AJ is compliant with what his mum said and says it was a family dog. But then in private, he basically reveals to the doctor that it was caused by someone not in my family. And then he said, "Mum did not mean to hurt me." That breaks my heart. Absolutely breaks my heart. This little, defenseless, innocent, helpless, abused, beautiful boy is protecting his abuser. It just demonstrates the level of loyalty in that little lad's little finger compared to the horror of a parent that he was born to. That even when she's doing the most heinous things to him, boiling water thrown over him, falling downstairs, clearly after being pushed, all these things are going on behind closed doors. And yet, when he is in the presence of people that can save him, he chooses to save her. It's astonishing to me how unfair the world can feel at times. And it's highlighted by that interaction. He is just protective of this woman who is destroying him. Another person who gives evidence during the case is Officer Michael Maloney. He was employed as a Crystal Lake police officer. He got access to Joanne Cunningham's iPhone data and went on the iCloud as well. He found a video from March 4th, 2019. It's horrific. It depicts Joanne Cunningham recording AJ as he is lay on a bare mattress in a crib. He's got these white bandages covering his forearms and his waist. He's got this really large blue ice pack over his face, and he's got really swollen eyes with dark red bruising. And Joanne is at this point, in spite of this child clearly being very injured, berating this gorgeous little boy for soiling the mattress. He's absolutely being taken to task for being a child. So that video demonstrates just how callous she is. And it's clear that Joanne is the person who's guilty of inflicting those injuries, because Andrew Freund in the interview admits that that was the case. Then we have a video from March 17th, 2019. This is 11:31 a.m. AJ's got lots of bruising, and at that point he's attending the St. Thomas the Apostle Church with his family. So they've got actual video testimony, even though he was out at church, that he's still very injured. Then they've got a video from March 27, 2019. This is where Joanne is cornering AJ in the bathroom and really getting angry with him because he says that he's going to get her in trouble with someone because he doesn't have any power. So he's clearly telling her, look, if you carry on doing this, I need to tell somebody. And he's threatening her in a childish way, as you would, because he has no way of controlling his environment. He's trying to scare her by using a threat of somebody else. And he's got visible cuts and bruising to his face in that video and his forehead. And she just starts to interrogate him, is the only word, about who's going to get her into trouble, how he's going to manage to do that. Then she grabs his throat, she pins him against the wall. And then whilst he is choking for air, she asks him if anyone else does evil things in this house. And AJ responds, no, just me. And then she shouts at him, do you really think Daddy would choose you over me and Parker? It's like she enjoys deriding him. This gorgeous little boy. He's so weak in comparison to her. And yet there she is, just enjoying, lauding this power, lauding this position over him. And not just abusing him, not just being violent, not just choking him to a point where he can hardly breathe, but letting him know that no one's coming, no one's going to believe him, no one's going to help him, and no one's going to believe him. Literally taking every potential piece of hope that he could have, that one day someone's going to save him from that situation, and just decimating it and enjoying decimating it. Then we had Dr. Mark Wittek. He's the forensic pathologist I mentioned earlier on, who did the autopsy. He said that the swollen brain was the thing that ultimately caused his death. AJ's brain literally been crushed into his skull to the point that it shut the rest of his body down. I don't even want to imagine how agonising that would have been for that little boy of 5 years of age. Prosecutors also presented the court with text messages that had been written with AJ's parents after he died, which are so telling because they were basically trying to make pains to cover their tracks. So discussing future plans for AJ and his brother, including decorating Easter eggs and what they might do to improve AJ's behaviour. A couple of Mary Poppins type characters. Obviously it doesn't make any sense because there's nothing else on the phones that indicate they give a crap. But hey, you know, when you're delusional and believe you can outsmart the authorities when you carried out such a heinous crime, why not knock yourself out and try and cover your tracks by writing some text messages that just implicate you further? Andrew Freund even wrote on one of them, give the boys a hug and a kiss for me. Oh, it's so calculating that. To actually know that your child is dead, to know that you killed him, to know that you've buried him, and then to concoct a picture of parenting bliss and care. It's disgusting. I think they should add another 30 years to any sentence just for doing that, genuinely. Mental health experts were also brought in on several occasions to speak to JoAnn Cunningham to assess her. They determined she had cluster B personality disorder, so that's marked by antisocial personality disorder, BPD, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. So obviously that demonstrates that there would have been extremes in her personality and also some problematic behaviours associated with that particular classification. She had apparently suffered rape and abuse at a young age, and she was known to have extreme rage and anger issues. With respect to something like borderline personality disorder, that does not make you a killer, by the way, by any stretch of the imagination, but that's often linked to trauma. So essentially, if you've been raped and abused as a child, then you are likely going to struggle to regulate your emotions, understandably, because the world was not safe for you. But when we're looking at something like narcissism, well, that's a whole heap of difference. That genuinely means that you've got a grandiosity about your personality, you believe you're entitled, and you really think you can act however the hell you wish to. Often it's also noted as being something that has deep-rooted insecurity at its root. So when you have that cluster B personality issue, there are going to be problems in the way that you act and the way sometimes you step outside what the expected norms are for behaviour. But like I said, when it comes down to BPD in particular, that is not going to make you a murderer on any day. Now, after a day of testimony in her sentence hearing, JoAnn Cunningham was actually given a chance to stand in front of the judge and to make her statement. She gave this pretty tearful, emotional speech, which was weird because it went like this. I've had the privilege of having AJ as a son. And when I had him, those were the happiest days of my life. I loved him, I miss him, and there's nothing that I wouldn't do to bring him back. Well, you didn't need to lose him, you murdered him. It's as simple as that. You've literally admitted to it. That's why you stood in court right now doing this statement. If they were the happiest days of your life, let me tell you, they were the worst of his. They were so bad, he died. You don't get to have a worse day than that day as a kid, when your mother literally murders you. And she was very vague when it came down to her son's killing. Instead, she just went on about her own difficult life, because that is what a narcissist will do. It really is. If ever there was an example and evidence. Sorry, JoAnn, could you just give us a demonstration of what a true narcissist is? Oh, really, me? You want me to show you what a true narcissist is because I'm the most important person in the room? I do, go ahead. Okay, here we go. I am living proof of what physical and mental proof can create. I've always been made out to be society's throwaway or outcast. I've never thought of my own well-being. And even if I did, I couldn't help myself. What? One, doesn't make a lot of sense, JoAnn. Two, how come it's all about you when this is about the murder of your child? Bear in mind, what she's done to her child goes against everything she's just mentioned. She's never thought of her own well-being. What? All you did was think about your own needs over your child. All you did was use him as a punching bag to manage your own problems. You didn't think about anybody at any point aside from yourself. And I appreciate that there has been a great fall from grace from her original parenting all those years ago where people said she was devoted, but we cannot look at her then, we have to look at her now. And what she is a monster of a mother. It's as simple as that. And her statement, it stopped entirely short of apologising for her actions. And my God, she should be apologising every moment of every day. Prosecutor Patrick Keneally said, she has beaten this little boy to the edge of death, locked him in his room where he had to endure the bleak process of death all by himself. She hasn't been sitting here crying for AJ. She hasn't been sitting here crying for anybody other than herself. Keneally pleaded with the judge for the maximum sentence of 60 years. And I have to say, I agree with Keneally. I think what he said is absolutely appropriate. It's clear that she only cares about her own needs. She's not concerned about the actions that have led to the execution of this child. When it came down to sentencing, Judge Wilbrant told Joanne her actions were inhumane, repulsive, and frankly shocking. Said it was a horrible death preceded by a horrible life. Miss Cunningham was responsible for that life, and now she must be responsible for his death. AJ was an innocent, precious little boy whose life was taken away from him after he endured what we now know was much pain and suffering. He sentenced her to 35 years in prison. I don't know whether that's long enough, with respect, when you think about how that little boy died. Such a bleak, helpless, hopeless situation, such a terrifying prospect of that little 5-year-old child, probably knowing he was gravely ill, suffering, and dying alone in the dark. I don't know whether 35 years is an appropriate sentence. Andrew Freund, of course, when it came down to him and giving his point to the court, he pinned most of the blame and abuse on Cunningham. He minimised the role that he played in his son's death. He claimed that it was Joanne Cunningham who abused their child, that AJ was forced to take cold showers because of her, and that he managed to get her to do that because she had initially beat him. So even though it was bad, it wasn't as bad as it had been. He, of course, got to take a plea deal because that means singing like a canary is going to help. They're going to be able to put her away for longer. So he pled guilty to aggravated battery of a child, involuntary manslaughter, and concealment of the homicidal death, which, again, I think he's as complicit as she is. He's allowed it to take place. He buried the body of that poor boy, and I hope he rots in hell. He actually got 30 years in jail. Because of the sentencing rules, the judge did actually admit that he could be released after serving less than 19 years, which is just horrible to imagine that he's only going to serve that amount of time for doing something so diabolical and get to live the last years of his life freely, potentially. He did get disbarred January 21st, 2021, but you would imagine that. You would imagine that it wouldn't be legally appropriate to have a murderer's assistant and an abuser of children being allowed to be somebody who appears as your attorney in court. Now, Cunningham Yes, Joanne Cunningham, the woman who apparently has acknowledged that she's responsible and accountable for the murder of her child, the death of her child, she decided that she wasn't that happy with the sentence. It blows my mind. This is what blows my mind. How can you not want to just spend every day of your life in prison for the rest of your life? If you have any conscience whatsoever and you have killed your child in this way, you would not want to see the light of day because you would not feel that you deserved it, but not Joanne Cunningham. No, she files a petition on her own behalf seeking unspecified relief under the Post-Conviction Act in 2022, claiming the 14th, 8th and 6th Amendment rights were violated. So there's this handwritten 5-page statement that said she had ineffective counsel and was not allowed to testify on her own behalf in court. Which is a good thing, because if Joanne Cunningham had been allowed to testify on her own behalf in court, I think that they'd have all been throwing things at her and they'd have sentenced her for 357 years in prison just for being so inauthentic. I've watched her in a couple of interviews. Believe me, it is toe-curlingly difficult to stomach her. But nonetheless, this is what she does. Claims the officers also didn't read her the Miranda rights to her before she was questioned. Also, the 8th Amendment violated by excessive sentencing imposed on her. You get 30 odd years, your son didn't get more than 5 alive because of your actions. But this is what selfish, egocentric narcissists do. She also said that she'd been on psychiatric medications for a long period of time, that she hadn't been monitored by a doctor or mental health professional while she was in the McHenry County Jail. She said she'd suffered hallucinations whilst in jail. She was on prescribed meds that had severe side effects during her pregnancy and after. And so she's really pleading that it's all been very unfair to her. And the outcome of that appeal was that Judge Robert Wilbrant issued a 3-page order denying Cunningham's petition. Yep, said that Joanne Cunningham's claims appear to be without legal merit. I think we can all agree with that, just knowing the bones of this case. Joanne Cunningham's claim about her sentence being cruel and unusual, genuinely, that was the claim, that judge said is patently without merit. Of course it is. She deserved everything she got. And he went on to say, the court finds the pleadings do not provide the gist of a meritorious claim of a substantial deprivation of federal or state constitutional right. Absolutely they don't. She deserved everything she got, if not more. And I bet every single one of you listening to this thinks that she deserved double the sentence she ended up receiving. The records show that she's expected to be released on April the 24th, 2054. Now, bear in mind, this actual case isn't just about the horrible death of a child. This is also about the grave failures of the actual people who were employed to make sure that these kind of things do not happen to children. Alarmingly, records show that the police and the DCFS had already visited the Freud's home multiple times, even before AJ was born. I cannot tell you how extensive the list is. It's enormous. I'll go through a few of them, but genuinely, it's so long, it would be a whole other video just to go through how many times they were called and how many failures there have been. Because the truth is, if action had been taken, AJ wouldn't be dead. So initially, even before AJ was born, there were lots of calls about Joanne. So when she had a foster child, there were calls regarding the care of her foster child, also about her abusing prescription drugs. The case got labelled unfounded, so they didn't find enough credible evidence of abuse. And DCFS also received other calls about environmental neglect and causing danger to Joanne's eldest son, who now lives with a different family, but back then obviously was present. And they also said that they felt that she was using and abusing prescription drugs around that child. Again, the case was closed with no action. Then when AJ's born, literally 2 days after, DCFS received a report saying that she was taking drugs, that she was neglectful. Then AJ and Joanne Cunningham actually test positive for opiates and benzodiazepines. So he's born addicted to these. A month later, DCFS grant temporary custody and AJ's removed from his mother's care, placed with his cousin. That was in a relative foster home. Joanne and Andrew both start participating in parenting classes, drug treatment programs, because they want to get custody of AJ. So they obviously want some desire there to get him back. In December 2013, Lorelei Hughes, that's Joanne Cunningham's mother, she filed a petition for an order of protection against her daughter. So at that point, she's accusing Joanne Cunningham and Andrew of forcing Joanne's eldest son to live in constant fear, hunger and filth, as well as denying him medical care, food, clean clothing, and a healthy living environment. She had actually been looking after him since October 2012, and she didn't want to see her grandson return to the care of her daughter because she knew that she was openly taking prescription drugs and she was addicted to them, and it was making her a terrible mother. On December the 30th, 2014, the younger brother, Parker Freund, is born, and he actually remains in JoAnn's care. Then they get custody of AJ. That's June 2015. He gets ordered to be returned to his mother. At this point, he's 18 months of age, so he's obviously had an attachment to the cousin, but now he's got the unrest of being transitioned back to a place that is going to essentially be a hellhole for him. Now, whilst it's clear that both Andrew Freund and Joanne Cunningham are the guilty parties in this situation, the systemic failures that led to AJ being in their care is something that is the responsibility not just of them but of the state, because the failures have been horrific. First of all, Joanne Cunningham had been seen as an unfit parent prior to having AJ and Parker. Her son had been taken by her mother to look after, and she had essentially, with her foster child, also lost that foster child within her care because she was problematic. She was taking drugs around them, she was addicted to painkillers, she was abusive, the house was horribly, horribly treated. There was environmental neglect and obviously child neglect, and so she was not fit to be in the presence of children as far as being a primary carer is concerned. When she lost custody of AJ, she lost custody of him for 18 months. He went and lived with a cousin of hers for that 18 months where he was thriving. But he was returned to her care after she had his younger brother, Parker. And that should ideally never have happened. Now, I will say that there were 26 visits, apparently, by youth services to check on the environment, and allegedly, the Youth Service Bureau worker who made those 26 unannounced visits between June 2015 and April 13, 2016, said they didn't see any signs of abuse and neglect. And so a juvenile court case closed in 2016 on AJ. That seems to have been a failure, without a doubt. I think that there must have been telltale signs of abuse. I think there must have been telltale signs of problems with environmental neglect, but it happened. So now AJ and Parker are in the care of their parents, but clearly the abuse is escalating and escalating and escalating. And this demonstrates such a lack of care from the authorities who are meant to be looking after these children, who are meant to be visiting. And every time they visit, because somebody raises an issue and says that they've seen a child who's injured, or said that they're concerned about the environment, and we're talking police officers are putting in complaints, doctors are putting in complaints, they go and visit and say everything's fine. And I mean, literally, we're talking about dog feces and urine, children's feces and urine all over the floor. You can't move through certain areas because it's like massive hoarding is taking place. It's filthy, it's infested with cockroaches. And yet, every time a worker goes to see what the conditions are, they say there's nothing problematic. It just beggars belief that that can happen. So in September 2023, when it's explored how many failings have taken place, they end up having a trial for 2 former DCFS workers. They were charged with 2 felony counts each of endangering the life of a child and reckless conduct. And the prosecutors allege that the former DCFS specialist Carlos Acosta and his supervisor Andrew Polovin, they failed to follow the policies of the DCFS when they returned AJ to the home in December 2018. In particular, McHenry County State Attorney Patrick Canale, they accused them of conducting a sham investigation into the welfare of AJ and his younger brother. Officer Kimberly Shitbow and Dr. Janelle Shannon, they were the 2 who were really concerned about AJ. They testified for the prosecution about the bruises that they'd seen on him. And the prosecutor actually presented that testimony over a 4-day period because there was a lot to present. Now, the defense attorneys, they said, listen, these guys did the best they could do. With the regulations at the time, there was nothing else that they could have carried through. And they disagreed with the procedures being used as examples by the prosecution. They picked apart the inconsistencies in the witness accounts and accused the actual experts of Monday morning quarterbacking. So the reason that they were trying to go hard on what the prosecution was saying is that typically when it comes to cases like this, workers like Acosta and Polovin, they've got immunity from prosecution if they have acted at least to a degree that is considered acceptable. Even if things have gone wrong, they won't get into trouble. But if they can prove as a prosecution they acted willfully in a reckless manner, then it's a different story. Now, the defence attorneys said that this was all rubbish. They had done the best that they could with the regulations at the time. They tried to pick apart any inconsistencies in the witness accounts. They even accused the experts who were brought in by the prosecution of Monday morning quarterbacking. And to be fair, typically workers like Acosta and Polovin, they usually have immunity from prosecution unless they're found to have acted in a reckless manner, so in a willfully reckless manner essentially. They didn't actually give any evidence in their defence, and the defence closed without calling any witnesses at all. They gave the closing arguments on Friday the 13th of October 2023, and the prosecution during his closing argument, they said, unfortunately and fatally for AJ, he had the 2 DCFS workers who couldn't have cared less. It's a pretty powerful statement, basically drawing a line under it and saying these individuals are why this child's dead. The defence closing argument, so Acosta's defence attorney Rebecca Lee said, the death of AJ Freund was tragic, but the people responsible for his murder are in prison. Whilst Matthew McQuaid, so that's Polovin's attorney, stated, we are not asking for forgiveness or any understanding. We are seeking and asking for findings of not guilty. So obviously stating there, we don't have a case to answer as far as we're concerned. This guy was just doing his job. I do understand on both levels that the attorneys feel that the right person and people are in prison. The parents are obviously the ones who are fully culpable, but you have to look at chains of causation. What are the fractures in the foundations? What could have prevented this case? And with respect, if people did their job well and removed AJ and Parker, they'd still be alive. When it came down to the outcome, there were 4 hours of closing arguments, and Judge George Strickland ruled that Acosta ignored red flags, and that those red flags could have saved AJ's life. He said that there was a refusal to investigate parts of the AJ case on Acosta's part, and that some of his reports were actually dishonest. So he was found guilty of 2 counts of child endangerment. So Acosta actually faces a 2 to 10 years in prison for each count of child endangerment. Now, they could actually get a sentence of probation. That could be possible as well. They're due back in court on December the 13th, 2023. That's when a sentencing date will likely be set. But that's a strong message. It's a powerful message, isn't it? It's letting them know these things cannot happen. These mistakes cannot occur. This laziness in work where lives are concerned is not acceptable. And there are strong, severe consequences. And I think that's so powerful to get that voice out there, that when you have a vocation, when you are protecting children, you have to take it so seriously, because AJ's life could have been saved. There is a legacy for AJ. It's a group named RAW for AJ. Tracy Kotzman, so she's the founder of the group. She said initially she just felt this real empathy for the child welfare workers who'd been called to investigate AJ's family for abuse. But then after learning that a previous DCFS investigation didn't actually result in the removal from the home, she just felt really angry. And she said, I just didn't see how it could happen with DCFS involvement. She said, I think it's terrible that eyes and ears were on this child and nothing was done. Kotzman actually attended the funeral, and she made a promise to do what I can to get justice for him. So she's formed RAW for AJ through Facebook. She spurred community members to rally at court hearings involving AJ's parents and the 2 DCFS workers. And she says the case of AJ is just one example of how dysfunctional the DCFS system is. In April 2022, the group actually rallied at the state capitol to call more attention to the failures of the Illinois DCFS. She displayed more than 300 pairs of children's shoes, representing the number of children who died from 2019 to 2021 and had prior contact with DCFS. She named this event Empty Souls for the Souls Lost in DCFS. I found that harrowing. 300 pairs of shoes between 2019 2021 that should have had children walking in them, but who will never walk in them because their lives were cruelly snuffed out. When you hear things put into those contexts, wow, doesn't it wake you up? Isn't it blindsiding? And isn't it tragic that so many children are failed in so many ways? They say it takes a village to raise a child, and it does, and it should, and every single one of us is part of that village. Those children, both Parker and AJ and the other children that she had care of, they were all failed to some degree. And it's so powerful when you see how many voices had tried to step in to protect this child, how many people had called in, how many people had risked defending, and still the DCFS didn't do enough. And because of that, AJ ultimately lost his life. I know at the hands of his mother and his useless father, but nonetheless, things could have happened, changes could have been made, protection could have been given, and they weren't. And because of that, AJ lost his life. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Do you know any more about the case? Have you got any bits of information that I haven't been aware of? Please share in the comments section. And as ever, this video is 100% dedicated to AJ, a life cut short, a life that was full of pain instead of full of love and joy. Wherever you are now, we all pray that you are flying high in bliss. And believe me, you'll never have to see your mother again, because that waste of space, she is going straight to hell when she takes her last breath. Be safe, guys. Take care. See you next time.